Fu Chu-li was marched into Kaishiku, the main public execution ground of Beijing, on the morning of April 10, 1905. He was a Mongol guard who had murdered his own master, a prince of the Aohan banner in Inner Mongolia. For that crime, the Qing court sentenced him to Lingchi, a punishment so notorious in the West that it earned its own English nickname, Death by 1,000 Cuts. Standing somewhere in that crowd was a French soldier with a camera, and the photographs he took that day would go on to define how the entire world understood Chinese punishment for the next 100 years. Within 2 decades, those images would be sitting in French psychology textbooks, and within 60 years, they'd be the centerpiece of a philosopher's book about ecstasy and pain, traveling further and further from the man they actually depicted. There's just one problem with all of that. Almost everything most people think they know about what those photographs actually show is wrong, and the real history is both less cartoonish and, in its own way, far stranger than the legend. Before we get into what actually happened to Fu Chu-li, we need to talk about the legend first, because the legend is the entire reason this video exists. The story you've probably heard goes something like this. Lingchi was the single most sadistic execution method ever devised by any civilization on Earth. The executioner would slice exactly 1,000 pieces of flesh from the condemned, starting at the fingers and toes and working inward, keeping the victim alive and fully conscious for hours, sometimes days, peeling them apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left to remove. Some retellings go even further, claiming the executioner worked from an actual chart, a body divided into precisely numbered zones, and that a truly skilled executioner could keep a man breathing through 999 of his 1,000 cuts before finally letting him die on the 1,000th. It's a vivid, horrifying image. It's also almost entirely fiction, built by people who never witnessed the punishment, embellished by people who wanted it to be true, and repeated by everyone after them because nobody bothered to check. Most of that fiction traces back to one specific source, a French writer named Louis Carpeaux, who published a sensational account in 1913 claiming he had personally watched Fu Chu-li's execution and recorded its every grisly detail. He hadn't. Historians who later went digging through the actual Chinese court archives discovered that Carpeaux had fabricated the execution decree itself, inventing official-sounding language out of thin air to give his account a borrowed authenticity it never earned. That invented narrative then collided with the real photographs decades later, when the French philosopher Georges Bataille republished them in a 1961 book exploring eroticism and ecstasy, using Carpeaux's fabricated account as the caption to explain what viewers were looking at. Bataille became fixated on a single image in that set, the expression on a dying man's face, convinced he was witnessing a kind of mystical rapture inside human agony. What he was actually doing was projecting his own theories about pain and transcendence onto a photograph of a state execution on the other side of the planet. And it's that projection, not the historical record, that got copied from book to book, documentary to documentary, until it calcified into accepted fact. The man in Bataille's favorite photograph wasn't even reliably confirmed to be Fu Chu-li in the first place. Nobody checked. It was simply too good a story not to keep repeating. So if that's the myth, what did Lingchi actually involve, and where does it even come from? The practice first appears in Chinese law as far back as the Liao dynasty's legal code in 1036, and from there it stayed on the books, on and off, for roughly 900 years, carried forward through the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties as the harshest penalty the state had available. It sat at the top of an older system called the Five Punishments, a graded ladder of corporal penalties stretching back to the Xie and Shang dynasties that once included tattooing the face, amputating the nose or feet, and castration, with death as the final rung. By the time Lingchi entered the picture, it was reserved for crimes the state treated as almost unthinkable: high treason, mass murder, and the offense Confucian China considered close to unforgivable: a child killing a parent. To understand why the punishment took the shape it did, you have to understand the belief sitting underneath it. In Confucian thought, your body wasn't fully your own. It was a gift inherited from your ancestors that you were obligated to return intact. Deliberately cutting or dismembering it wasn't just physical suffering. It was a spiritual catastrophe, a desecration that followed you into whatever came next. Historians Timothy Brooke, Jerome Borgen, and Gregory Blue spent years working through Qing legal archives for a book on exactly this subject, and they argue the real design of the punishment wasn't about maximizing physical pain the way Western legend assumes. It was about destroying what they call somatic integrity, denying the condemned an intact body and, along with it, any hope of an intact existence in the world to come. The horror was never really supposed to be about how long it lasted. It was about how complete the destruction was. And in the actual surviving court record, Lingchi was nowhere near as prolonged as the legend insists. Take Wang Wei-kin, a former official convicted of murdering 2 entire families, executed at that same Beijing ground in October of 1904, just months before Fu Chu-li. Documentation of his execution shows him bound to a wooden frame while the executioner removed pieces of flesh from his chest, arms, and thighs, then amputated his limbs, and finally beheaded him. In total, the executioner is recorded making roughly 3 dozen cuts. 3 dozen, not 1,000. The whole process is described as lasting minutes, not days. There was no thousand zone chart. There was a knife, a wooden frame, and a state-employed professional doing a job whose entire point was public deterrence in front of a crowd, not some endurance contest of suffering. It also helps to understand where Lingchi sat within the broader machinery of Chinese capital punishment, because it wasn't the default. For most condemned prisoners following the Sui and Tang dynasties, a death sentence meant one of 2 outcomes, hanging or straightforward decapitation. Slow slicing only entered the system later during the Song dynasty as an additional harsher tier sitting above those 2, reserved deliberately for the smaller set of crimes the state wanted to mark out as uniquely unforgivable. The Qing legal code even allowed wealthier families to pay their way out of an ordinary death sentence entirely, commuting it for a substantial sum in copper cash, though that option existed for the standard penalties, not for the cases serious enough to draw Lingchi. The punishment, in other words, functioned as a kind of legal exclamation point, a way for the state to signal that this particular crime sat outside the normal moral universe, which is exactly why it was applied so rarely and so deliberately, not handed out wholesale the way pulp depictions of imperial China like to imply. Lingchi also wasn't reserved purely for men, and it wasn't always reserved purely for the obviously guilty. In 1542, a group of palace women attempted to assassinate the Jiajing emperor in his own sleeping quarters, and when the plot failed, Lingchi was inflicted on the women involved, with their bodies displayed publicly afterward as a warning. And because treason charges in imperial China could be applied loosely, sometimes as a political weapon rather than a genuine threat to the throne, the line between who deserved this punishment and who simply had powerful enemies was thinner than the law pretended. That's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular horror version of this story, because the popular version needs Lingchi to be a punishment for monsters, when in reality it was sometimes a punishment for people who had simply lost a court intrigue. There's another detail the legend almost always leaves out, and it might be the single most important one. Executioners in late imperial China had documented discretion to grant mercy, and the most common form that mercy took was brutally simple. An early, fast cut to the throat or a thrust to the heart, delivered near the very start of the process, which killed the prisoner almost immediately, after which any remaining cuts were made on a corpse instead of a living person. Sometimes that mercy was the executioner's own judgment that a particular crime didn't call for prolonged suffering. Sometimes, far more cynically, it was simply purchased, with a condemned man's family bribing the executioner to finish things quickly, rather than let the spectacle drag on. Brooke, Borgen, and Blue also note that the condemned were frequently dosed with opium beforehand, blunting the experience considerably before the first cut was ever made. None of this makes Lingchi humane, to be clear. It was still a brutal, deliberately degrading public execution, engineered to strip a person of their body, their dignity, and their place in the next life, all performed in front of a watching crowd. But the distance between the documented reality and the Western legend of 999 fully conscious cuts is enormous, and that gap tells you a lot less about China than it does about the people who built the legend in the first place. That legend didn't appear out of nowhere either. The photographs themselves had a strange, tangled afterlife, even before Bataille got hold of them. French soldiers stationed in Beijing had the chance to photograph at least 3 separate Lingchi executions across 1904 and 1905, including Wang Weiqin's, an unidentified case from January 1905, possibly involving a young man convicted of killing his mother and Fu Chulei's. Those images first circulated in a multi-volume French psychology treatise published by Georges Dumas across the 1930s and early 1940s, long before Bataille ever touched them. When Bataille's book came out in 1961, it wasn't even Bataille himself who attached Carpeau's fabricated narrative to the photos. That mistake was made by his collaborator, a writer using the pen name Loduca, who mismatched the wrong written account to the wrong set of images entirely. So the single most famous documentation of Lingchi in Western culture is the product of a French soldier's photograph, misfiled into the wrong psychology textbook, captioned decades later with a fabricated story written by a man who wasn't there, by an editor who wasn't paying close enough attention, all eventually credited to a philosopher who was using it to argue something about ecstasy that had nothing to do with the actual Mongol guard being executed in Beijing. Layer after layer of secondhand handling, and at the bottom of all those layers, a real man with a real name who really was put to death for a real crime, almost lost entirely underneath the myth built on top of him. By the late 19th century, European writers and colonial officials were also actively constructing an idea of so-called Oriental cruelty, and it served a very convenient political purpose, letting empires that were simultaneously colonizing huge stretches of Asia tell themselves a flattering story about their own moral superiority. Lingchi became one of the centerpieces of that story, described endlessly, verified rarely, and folded straight into pulp villains and exoticized horror fiction long after the practice had actually stopped. Meanwhile, the real history happening inside China told a very different story, one of a legal system that had spent centuries arguing with itself over whether this punishment should exist at all. Even the use of Lingchi for supposed treason was often shaky ground, applied to figures like the Ming dynasty, eunuch Liu Jin, and the Ming general Yuan Chonghuan on treason charges that were themselves widely doubted even at the time. As far back as the 12th century, a scholar named Lu Yu wrote a pointed argument against the punishment, observing that a person's organs could still be functioning, their senses still working, even after their flesh had been stripped away, and calling the practice an injury to benevolent government itself. That argument got copied and handed down by generations of scholars and jurists across dynasty after dynasty, all the way to a late Qing reformer named Shen Jiaben, who finally folded it into the legal memorandum that secured Lingchi's abolition in 1905. External pressure mattered too, though it moved slower than people assume. As early as 1866, right around the same years, Britain itself was abolishing hanging, drawing, and quartering back home. A British diplomat stationed in China named Thomas Francis Wade was already pushing, unsuccessfully at the time, for Lingchi to be scrapped. Internal reform and outside pressure built for nearly 40 years before either one actually won. Which brings us back to Fu Chu-li on that morning in April 1905. His execution took place just 2 weeks before the abolition formally took effect, making him, as far as the surviving record shows, the last person ever officially put to death by Lingchi in Chinese history. The irony writes itself. The exact practice being photographed in its final moments was already being legislated out of existence, killed off by decades of internal legal reform that had nothing to do with European cameras or outrage. You'll sometimes see it claimed that the photographs themselves caused such an international scandal that they directly forced the Qing court's hand. But the timeline doesn't really support that version of events. The reform was already written and moving through the system. The execution ground photographs simply happened to arrive at the exact moment the practice was ending, which made them feel like the cause of its abolition when they were really more like a coincidence that turned itself into its own legend. There are persistent rumors that Lingchi was used a handful more times after 1905, unofficially, during the chaos of China's warlord era and the early conflicts of the decades that followed, supposedly inflicted on a political assassin in 1928, who, according to the same unverified rumor, was made to watch a family member killed before his own execution began, and on a rebel leader sometime in the 1930s during the unrest that preceded full civil war. These claims show up constantly in popular retellings, but they rest on second-hand reports and conjecture rather than verified court records, which is the same shaky kind of sourcing that built the Carpo legend to begin with. As far as documented officially sanctioned state executions go, the practice ends with Fu Chu Li, and it ended not because a foreign camera shamed an empire into reform, but because Chinese legal scholars had been building the case against it for the better part of 1,000 years before that camera ever showed up. So why does the myth still beat the documented reality every single time? Partly it's Bataille's 1961 book, which took a fabricated eyewitness account and turned it into a philosophical meditation on ecstasy that academics kept citing for decades without ever tracing it back to its source. Partly it's just that horror travels faster than correction, and death by 1,000 cuts is simply a better, punchier phrase than the actual Chinese term, which translates closer to slow slicing or the lingering death, with none of the false mathematical precision of an exact 1,000 attached to it. And partly it's because the real history, a centuries-long internal legal argument about cruelty, mercy, opium, bribery, and what a body is owed by its ancestors, just isn't as cinematic as a torture chart with 1,000 numbered squares on it. It's worth sitting with that internal argument for a second, because it's the part that gets erased the most. China's own legal tradition had been uneasy about excessive cruelty and punishment for far longer than people assume. The Tang dynasty's legal code, centuries before Lingchi reached its height under the Qing, had already declined to include certain punishments, like the public exposure of a severed head, in its official table of the 5 punishments, precisely because they were considered to cross a line into needless degradation. That same unease, the idea that a punishment could be lawful and still be too cruel, is the exact thread that Liu Yu pulled on in the 12th century, and it's the same thread Chen Jiabin finally tied off in 1905. It's a debate that runs for the better part of a millennium inside Chinese jurisprudence, conducted by scholars and officials who took the question seriously long before any Western diplomat showed up to weigh in. The real history doesn't hand you a villain methodically working a checklist of suffering. It hands you a legal system, slowly, stubbornly arguing itself out of a punishment it had inherited from 1,000 years of dynasties before it, while foreign observers watched only the final act through a camera lens and mistook the ending of the story for the whole thing.